Let's talk a little bit about. Tell me about the whole story with Shaq getting sued, the whole FTX thing. Give me the overview of what we're talking about here.
All right. So, as some people may know, and we don't need to go into all of the details, but FTX was this cryptocurrency company. The CEO was indicted, convicted, is in jail for 20 years. And, without going into great detail, there was tons of fraud, a whole lot of misrepresentations as it related to the company. Okay. Over, just sort of historically, whenever, celebrities endorse companies, typically they don't know that much about it, right? They're kind of giving them their name, image, and likeness, and they go along with it. So we haven't really seen much in the way of liability. We haven't seen lawsuits that have been successful in those regards, for somebody who's been a celebrity that's paired up with a company.
Right.
What's interesting in this one is the settlement has to be approved. You have to have these settlements approved. You can't just dismiss things in federal court. So we know that Shaq went ahead and settled for $1.8 million,
Right.
On behalf of this suit. So this suit's been probably brought for a whole bunch of these other investors that have been defrauded. There's still David Ortiz, Steph Curry, Gisele Bündchen, Tom Brady. Yeah. They're all in it. And what's interesting is actually a lot of the claims against them were just recently dismissed. So, I think in large part, a lot of this was strategic. I mean, hey, Shaq literally promotes more products, I think, than anybody. Him and Peyton Manning, right? They're in a race to do it.
Places, yeah.
So I think this might have been a cost of defense. How much money are we going to spend in this for how long to get some closure or anything done? But at least it's interesting because he went ahead and acknowledged that and paid seven figures. What I think we'll see are the days of almost when somebody was going to go out and endorse a product and they're a celebrity. Really, it was sort of national advertising, right? Somebody's with Chevrolet or McDonald's or what have you. But there's a whole new realm, really, with social media and other stuff where there's really a lot more in the way of specifics that people give that are endorsers. And so that's where I think some liability comes. And then here's the big one, okay? A lot of pro athletes are taking equity in companies. If you take equity in a company, then you're probably going to get meetings from a board. You're going to know other things that are going on in the company, and that's where liability is going to be created. We know that LeBron and several other, recent athletes have been real strong to go in and say, hey, I'll get together with Vitamin Water or Dre Beats or whatever these companies are, and they've taken equity in them, and really they've taken these companies to the next level. But once you're in the boardroom and you know what they're selling, and if what they're selling is fraudulent or there's a misrepresentation, that's where we might see some more liability. So this issue with Shaq, we got to see the way it plays out. But I think in the world of reels and people going on to Joe Rogan and saying, I use this product and I've lost all this weight, or they take some equity in it, we're going to see more and more liability for celebrities.
And was Shaq, did he have equity in the crypto company?
I don't believe so.
Yeah.
I think the facts are really bad for this case. Remember, he's paying $1.8 million, but I'll guarantee every listener out there, there's still no admission of liability on this. They're not saying anything, and the paperwork probably says, in light of all the different factors, ongoing litigation costs and the other, we're going to pay this money and we want to release and we want to get out of the lawsuit. So he hasn't admitted to knowing something wrong. And in this instance, I would doubt Shaq knew too much in the way of the specifics. From everything that I'd found out about FTX, the amount of money that was being paid to these celebrities was over the top. The CEO was an over the top, grandiose type personality. So I think that's a little bit of what was going on there. And really, the thing that was interesting with FTX is how many companies have this many big celebrities endorsing them, right?
Right. Yes.
I mean, that's a lot. Typically most are aligned with 1 to 2, right?
And these are A-listers now.
Right.
Point. But it begged another question for me that I wrote down here, but you're very thorough as always. You might have already answered it. Maybe may come down to whether the endorser is one of the owners of the company. But it did make me wonder, seriously, if somebody's driving a Lincoln and it malfunctions and they die, or can they sue Matthew McConaughey? I'm not asking it for frivolously either. I'm asking the question very seriously. Can they sue a national endorser who said, hey, this is the best car on the market, you should buy it?
if that person has no real knowledge about how they build the vehicle or do anything else, I don't
good.
think there is.
So Shaq probably settled a case that he would have won, but he settled it for $1.8 million because for him, that's probably not money that he will miss.
Right.
And it's certainly money he can make back by going to do another endorsement with some other company.
Right.
But do you think that had he wanted to play it out on principle, he would have lost the case?
I think he'd have really pretty strong arguments, especially in light of the recent dismissals of some of the claims against the other celebrities. You know, one of the things that we talk about practicing law all the time is the cost of defense, right? And so principle, you know, you just use the word, clients use it all the time or what have you. But, you know, if I called anybody up here and said, hey, I've got a great investment for you, you give me $8, I'll get you $5 back. Nobody wants a part of that. And so because there's a cost of defense and maybe there's not an opportunity here to get your attorney's fees back, to get the things that you expend, there's a decision to say, let's get some closure. Let's minimize what our costs are as it relates to it. Let's put FTX behind us. You know, and I say it all the time in the practice of law, and it's important in all of our lives, but there is a value to closure. And so I think it's that combination or the reason.
What were they looking for from Shaq? Was it like $25 million that he was being sued for?
You know, typically in these types of situations, you don't say the exact amount.
Okay.
You just say the amount is greater than what the jurisdictional amount is. And then, quite frankly, you go and conduct a whole bunch of discovery and try to figure out what's the highest amount of money that you think you could go and get on behalf of your client. So they didn't sue for a specific amount. What they were suing to say is that these endorsers essentially had knowledge, made representations. The people who invested relied on, you know, their representations to their detriment. They were damaged. And then they try to get in there, conduct some measure of discovery and come up with a theory to say, hey, what's the most amount of money we can get for our clients?
Brett, to that end, in typical civil cases, would the attorney for the plaintiff who's trying to win the case, I would think how much, for lack of a better way to say it, how much money the defendant has is a big part of that. Does it work like that or no?
As a plaintiff's lawyer, that's all he tries to do every day.
Yeah.
You can never discuss how much money the defendant has in a case. And if there's one thing I'd like every listener out there to listen, is whenever we go to trial in any personal injury case, the other person always has insurance. Always has insurance. There's always a corporation who's going to stand up and pay for it, but the jury never, ever gets to know about that in the case. And the reason why is we want to decide the case on the total amount. But I can tell you, having done what I've done for 20 years, there are two types of cases that we typically bring in a personal injury context. Most of them are auto cases, right? Auto cases where I sue Hayes Carline and he might have $5 million in insurance coverage. Nobody gets to know. Sometimes we bring what are called cases, which are uninsured or underinsured. So if the person hits you and say you have a $100,000 claim, but they have $10,000 of insurance, your own insurance kicks in. In that instance, the named defendant is Progressive or State Farm or whatever, and juries will award damages differently. If they think, hey, here's this good-looking Hayes Carline guy, he's just a nice guy and a dad, and they're trying to, ask for $1.5 million to make them whole, they'll moderate that. Progressive, these insurance companies, nobody likes them or cares about them. And so if you prove it, they'll assign an amount that's fair and just, and it might be that amount of money. So, they don't get to know how much money they have, but a lot of times just knowing who the defendant is, right?
Yeah,
if it's Dream Finders, they may not view it the same way as, little old lady from, the West Side.
Yeah, common sense would tell me that what you said, you answered it perfectly. By law, that can't be in play.
Right.
But common sense says it would be.
100%. But to answer your question, you don't get to go in and say, hey, we're only seeking $1 million in damages and they got $500 million, So
the reason I asked this, back to this case, okay, so Shaq had to settle. What about Brady and Giselle and all these people that I'm assuming have way more money than, maybe not way more money than Shaq, but similar money to Shaq? Right. Well, do you expect that we're going to see more about this? I mean, they were all investors too, right? Or endorsers too, I should say.
I think you'll see them pay monies that are closer to that and being the cost of defense and not hear what they may be seeking in the lawsuit, because based on the dismissals, I don't think they're overly strong cases unless They've got board meetings, emails, texts where people were made aware. But I can't fathom that any of those celebrities would remain involved in the case if they said, hey, I want to let you know this is essentially a Ponzi scheme and we're defrauding everybody, but just keep doing what you're doing, Tom, because the money's flowing in. And so I think in this instance, and from what I know about it, there was a very few people in the inner circle who knew what was actually going on there. And they were really aggressive personalities and went out and quite frankly, overpaid for access to some of these celebrities. And I think that's what all these celebrities are going to learn out of it. If somebody comes to me on an endorsement deal and the pricing and the standard is so far out of whack from everything else in the market, maybe this isn't legit.
It'll be interesting to see. Great work as always. That's Brett Hastings. He's from the Hastings Injury Law Firm.